On today's episode of the 80/20 podcast, we have Rob, who is known as the Quantified Scientist on YouTube. He has a ton of videos measuring wearables, health trackers, and giving us insights into which one is the most accurate. So today we're going to talk about all the things of like why he does what he does, the trackers that he loves the most, and what he's learned through all the testing. Rob, it's good to have you.
Thanks for having me in your beautiful studio.
Thanks for having me. And we're in his, if you're watching the audio or listening to the audio, we're in your studio space. Literally says TQS for the Quantified Scientist right here. We've got QS for, is that Quantified Self?
Yeah. No, well,
Quantified Scientist?
A bit of both.
Yeah. We got the whole studio behind the camera as well. So it's really cool to just see where the videos are made. So I'm honored. Thank you for having me over. Thank you for hosting me as well. So I really appreciate that. I think we've talked a lot about the past few days, and one thing I wanted to ask you is kind of how you got started in the quantified self movement. Like, what was the first piece that got you into it?
Yeah, so I'm a scientist, just as background, and I think the first step I took in the whole thing was originally just to communicate science to people, because I wanted to measure something that was easily understandable, and so that people could actually know what I do for a living, which is data science, so analyzing data. So my first ever venture into wearables was buying a Fitbit Charge 2 at the time and correlating my heart rate with what music I was listening to. And then I saw that my heart rate was higher during Iron Maiden than during Bob Dylan, for instance, mostly just because I was doing like laundry and cleaning with Iron Maiden, but that I could present also to people to actually explain what you can do with data instead of just explaining my normal science, which is a bit more complicated also from the biology side. And that somehow snowballed into thinking, I learned some things about myself with this Charge 2 at the time. And I thought you can actually measure a lot more. I started talking with some of my friends who are scientists, and it really grew into a big NS1 quantified self project where I've been getting weekly brain MRIs now for over 200 weeks, daily sleep EEGs. I also got a lot of these like complicated sleep measurements, polysomnography. I measure my microbiome. I've done 250 of those, so the bacteria in my gut, and a lot more. And it sort of became a scientific hobby project where we're now trying to create one of the biggest data sets out there for a single individual to see what we can learn from the connection between the brain, sleep, and the gut. So sort of like the blueprint project measurements, but in a bit of a different direction.
Yeah. So who's the most measured man in the world? Is it you or Brian Johnson?
Yeah, that's a good question. I guess in terms of pure health, maybe him. In terms of MRIs, I beat him for sure.
Yeah.
I think I beat everybody in the world in terms of real MRI scans. Like I don't think there's anybody with these number of MRIs.
That could be a video title. I've gotten the most MRIs ever.
I've been thinking to write to the Guinness World Book of Records to see if I can get it. Yeah, I have the email compiled already, so I just need to press send.
It's sitting in your drafts right there. That's funny. How did you get into science in the first place? Like, what? I know a lot of your work, like you have a PhD. A lot of your work right now is like under a university. Like, how did you get into that science world?
I think it's somehow naturally grew by the fact that I was always very quantitative in the things I did well, as in school. All the sciences were my best subjects. I found them most interesting, and I didn't like learning things by heart. I felt it was always kind of silly, but understanding things and then using them was sort of natural to me. So I actually studied chemistry originally, and this was more doing and understanding than purely learning by heart. And somehow I grew then into more data science because I think the lab is interesting, but takes a lot of time without results, whereas I think on the computer I can quickly get results, quickly have things done, have nice figures done, explain things to people. And that's also why I like YouTube, because you quickly get a result, you communicate it to people, and it gives them something they can hopefully learn from.
Yeah, that's awesome. And what do you, so you have a day job. You make YouTube videos, but that's not your main thing. You have a day job. What's your day job?
Yeah, so in normal life, I do what's called a postdoc. It basically means after you get your PhD, which is also called a doctorate, you do a post after doctorate, doc. Mm-hmm. And there I study the connection between the immune system, so your white blood cells, and different characteristics of the human body, often having to do with their genetics, the way their genes are regulated, the things their genes produce, and seeing why do certain people have a very poorly functioning immune system. So you might have a group of people with a certain disease, and we try to figure out what is different about their cells that they cannot fight the disease. Or maybe people who have a very strong immune system. There's people who are infected with the HIV virus, so the virus that can cause AIDS. Why is like 0.5% of the population basically protected from ever getting AIDS, even though they're infected? And these are the kind of questions we try to answer using big data. So I have very, very smart colleagues in the lab who collect all the data. I get the data and I have to answer the questions.
And your focus is data science.
Data science, yeah.
That. And knowing that now, knowing your background in science, how do you use that in your YouTube channel and in the comparison of like wearables and health?
Yeah, so I think on the one hand, I have some connections to people who can give me gold standard or silver standard reference devices. So for sleep, I work together with some sleep labs, so they can give me some devices that can somewhat reliably measure your sleep stages. So I have reference data, or I use a chest strap, which is just commercially available for heart rate. And then I can actually write code to analyze that in a systematic way and think about it, at least in a somewhat structured way that it makes it a fair comparison to other devices. And I mean, any video I make has a lot of weak points as well, because it's mostly focused on me with a limited set of data. But I think sort of the cost, like time spent versus reward, is sort of a balance I try to make, because if I just reviewed one device the whole year, I would have a really good data set, but then it would just be one device I test. So I have a limited amount of time to spend, but I think I still use the systematic same method for basically every watch. That makes it a fair comparison.
And what's your decision making around how to test each product? Like, what are the kind of limitations that you create for yourself?
So I basically need to do the same type of workouts in the same type of environment for all watches as far as I can control it. So I will do the same interval workout on my home trainer most days of the week. It will be more or less comparable between days. So that's the same test I do for every watch. I do a certain amount of outdoor cycling sessions, a certain amount of weightlifting sessions, and I try to keep the protocol so the same, more or less the same, but still also using the workout as sort of a personal getting more fit tool. But I try to standardize things and make it as fair as possible, so that what I communicate is similar between devices.
Yeah. I want to get more into the gold and silver standard stuff, but in a little bit. But first I want to ask about the N of 1.
Yeah.
I know you started incorporating your friends now too.
Yeah.
How much can we trust an experiment that is an N of 1? Like, how much value can that provide? Like, what are the things that we should be like weary of, and what are the things that we're like, that information is extremely valuable?
Yeah, there's definitely a limitation there. I still think a lot of the tests on YouTube in general are males that are doing it. Like, this is 95% of health reviewers are males. I think, I don't know, I'm guesstimating here, but this must be it. So I think even if you watch multiple channels, you will still be mostly looking at male-centric data. So the question is, does it translate to females? That's the first sort of general thing. Just looking at my data, I think the general large trends, as in which devices are doing really well, which are doing really poorly, and which are in the middle, will be more or less the same for most people were they to follow the same protocols that I do. There will be some variations, I expect, and I also see that in testing it on some of my friends. But then it does depend on me doing this exact type of protocol. So I tend to have really a break. If I do an interval, I totally stop working out for like a minute, whereas somebody else might keep moving, and that might have some influence because the heart rate doesn't drop as drastically all of a sudden, which is much harder for a device often to get that really big dip and big peak in heart rate. So I think the main thing is you will get some impression, but watch some other reviewers as well, get a general impression of which perform poorly and which perform well. But I think you will mostly get similar impressions between people. Heart rate is the easiest, I think to get multiple sources. Sleep tracking is a harder one. I think I'm one of the few people that systematically reviews this, just because there is less of a gold standard there. But there I recently went through the whole literature, like scientific literature, and tried to look at all studies that studied the quality of different brands in terms of sleep stage tracking. And this more or less aligned with my findings, so I felt a bit more comfortable and knowing that the results match up. And the benefit of my testing compared to literature is that I just tested so many more devices, and most literature is relatively outdated. So you're always talking about 1 or 2 generations ago before the whole scientific process is done. There's already a new device out.
Yeah, it's not just software, or not just hardware, but it's also
Exactly.
software too.
Like Aura is a great example of this, where even if they released generation 3 of the ring, so the latest one, they were still using the old sleep stage tracking algorithm, which wasn't amazing. And then just with a firmware upgrade, they really made it a lot better.
And the new software upgrade is amazing now, would you say?
It's one of the best ones. I think together it's almost, at least on me, it's close to Apple. If I look at literature, Aura and Apple are more similar, I'd say, but there are also not that many studies out on Apple Watches. The main study that's out on healthy sleepers is Apple Watches now.
And Apple's
is Apple's own study. So Apple is the only study that is done on the latest algorithm on healthy sleepers was produced by Apple, like with Apple Watches. And the only other recent Apple study was on non-healthy sleepers, like people with sleep problems. And this is where I think on sleep is the major limitation, where the moment you have major sleep issues, all sleep trackers like reduce so significantly in their performance. And this is something I cannot test. And this I realized when I really put all the literature together. I had a few studies that had poor sleepers, and all the same brands just shifted downwards in their performance.
And when you say shifted down in terms of performance, you mean in terms of like the sleep stages were more inaccurate?
More inaccurate.
What about like heart rate at night? Like
heart rate should still be fine. I think this is generally good. But I have a colleague, for instance, who has some problems with his heart rhythm isn't completely normal, and the Oura Ring just doesn't measure his heart rate. It just cannot, because he does an atypical rhythm. He just cannot deal with that. So as long as you don't have any heart issues, it should be quite easy if you have a watch or a ring to measure, and most at rest during sleep will be fine.
So this is another question I asked someone, but I see a lot of these ads where it's like it's an Oura Ring before and after. Like my deep sleep increased after I took the supplement. One question is like, what if I made decisions on the Oura Ring algorithm last year and I optimized my deep sleep, and then now they changed the algorithm, and then all of a sudden my deep sleep is drastically different. Like, how do I just, like, what happens there? I feel like I just lost trust in the whole algorithm. What if they change it again in a year from now, and I'm making decisions based on this software?
Yeah, that's, I think, tricky in general. This is also, I think, a marketing thing almost, because they are getting more accurate. So it should be a good thing, but you might feel like you lose something in a way. Like if your deep sleep decreases with the new algorithm, it might feel bad, but it's good. And the hope is that at least the deep sleep that they had before was at least somewhat representative of the amount. Or if you have many nights and the algorithm is decent, then if you have many nights to compare, like with and without whatever intervention you did, then hopefully it should at least be somewhat representative of the amount of deep sleep. Even if the new algorithm changes it, I expect if you do the experiment again, it will give you more or less the same result, provided the algorithm was already at a decent level. And where that minimum is, I don't know. I mean, there's so much unknown about these kind of things still. I think only now scientists are starting to embrace also using wearables in their research. For so long, the only thing they would do is PSG, so polysomnography with all these electrodes. Then it sort of seemed to have become acceptable to also use like smaller EEG devices where you only have a few electrodes which you can put on rather quickly. But you cannot do this on thousands of people, whereas you can give thousands of people a wearable. And now the algorithms are becoming better, so I'm seeing more and more people adapt it. Again, I mostly work with sleep scientists. This is not my field, but I've been becoming acquainted with it.
Do you think there's any value to tracking sleep stages? Like, what's the win there on an individual and maybe on a mass scale?
So for scientists, it's a different thing. Like if you have a scientific question, it's just interesting because you want to correlate certain things. On an individual level, I mean, the number one reason I do sleep stages for myself is just because I think it's cool to know and see what trends there are and see what things affect things. But as long as you have a relatively healthy sleep pattern, I would mostly look just at number of awakenings, time spent awake, how long does it take you to fall asleep. That cannot be too long, but Matthew Walker in a recent podcast also really emphasized it shouldn't be too short because it could be an indication of a sleep debt. For me, I just find it cool. So this is one factor. I think in terms of health, it's really difficult to optimize all these things and to put too much trust in a single night. I would also just look, if something is totally off one night, can be a sign that something is wrong. But small deviations, I don't focus on too much, but I do focus more on time spent awake and number of awakenings and these kind of things. Those are my first things to look at. And I think the very first step is just checking how much time am I giving myself to be in bed. But that can be relatively well done by most devices. And then the stages I just think are interesting. Sometimes you do see, my REM sleep is really poor now, and then I try to figure out for myself, is that because somehow the second half of my night was just poor sleep quality for some reason, because you tend to have more REM sleep in the later parts of your night, or it was something else going on. But yeah, I mostly look for deviations, and the first thing is wake moments, and otherwise, what are other things that are off from my normal good sleep.
Mm-hmm. So if like, I guess the most important quote unquote variables are like awake duration or awake moments, and maybe sleep duration, and then time to fall asleep, are there wearables or health trackers that are not able to get that data or are really bad that people should watch out for? Or are most of the ones in the market today like good enough where if you buy anything, you're going to get good data for those kind of like most important variables in a way?
I think there's a few really good ones that also do stages well, they do everything well, but most brands are good enough to track at least your total time spent in bed. Awake moments varies a bit, but these are also, I also don't know what they define as awake moments, right? I don't know if they follow some kind of general standard from the Sleep Society, basically, or if they think of their own metrics, what their basically their users want to see. But I would avoid most cheap Chinese brands because these are just bad generally. I think to get decent sleep stage tracking, you need a big data set to train your model, and they just didn't invest the money. I think they just didn't prioritize it. So if you have a Xiaomi device, and even Huawei, though they are generally better in quality, they still don't have good sleep tracking, at least on me, and also not what I found from others.
Okay, and I know the sleep tracking is compared to the gold standard or silver standard. What are some examples of gold and silver standards in the sleep space?
Yeah, so I don't know if silver standard is an official term. I use it. But
okay.
So gold standard is polysomnography. This is, you have all these electrodes on your head with a multitude of channels. So they measure EOG, so the movement of your eyes, EMG, so movement of some of the muscles, for instance, in your face. They measure your brain waves, that's EEG. So all of these are like electrical signals, which is what the E stands for. And then often you also measure oxygen saturation, heart rate, things like this. And classically, then somebody would manually go through the whole night, look at each 30 seconds of your sleep, and judge if this is, N1, N2, N3, N4, if you, depending on what. So there's specific standards, and we, in simple terms, translate this to light sleep, deep sleep, REM sleep, and awake. There's different stages that's used in science that are a bit more complicated, but for instance, N1 is a really rare stage that's only in the beginning of your night that basically might not be the most important, and it just turned N1 light sleep and N2 light sleep. Together it makes up light sleep. And some people, I think, split N3 and N4 into kinds of deep sleep. I think nowadays most people just call it N3 for deep sleep. And this N is non-REM, and then you have REM, which is REM sleep.
Interesting. And why is polysomnography or PSG the quote-unquote gold standard today?
I think because originally how sleep stages were defined was with this kind of EEG type measurements, and then this developed into a more elaborate thing, and this is just the way we've defined things, and which gives you a really high level of detail in terms of signal, so you can score it rather well. But still, if I give 3 scientists the exact same data and they've been trained to score it, they will also only agree, well, let's say we just stick to light sleep, deep sleep, REM sleep, and awake, they will agree maybe 90%. And this is like giving them the same actual recording. So there's also just a lot of calls you have to make. I'm not a trained scorer, but I've scored some things just for myself, or I've tried it when somebody else did it. And sometimes it's really difficult to judge because you're judging each 30 seconds of sleep, and you know the previous 30 seconds was REM sleep, and you see like a little bit of a specific eye movement, and you're like, I know that a little bit later there will be REM sleep again. Do I then also score this as like, you have to make these decisions, and there are rules, but they're not always easy to implement if you have so many channels to
Interesting. Huh. So even researchers are 90% close.
To themselves.
To themselves. Well, then what's the next best thing?
So then
to researchers, what's the next best algorithm, I guess?
So now it's, I think recently the first algorithm was accepted as an official accepted scoring algorithm by the American Sleep Society or some big overarching body. So now it's becoming more and more automated, where we have just AI doing it for us, which will be more robust. And what they often do when people score it is they have 3 people score it, and then they base it on the 3 scoring. So you can either take the majority vote or something, where then you get at least a little bit more reliable. But also it might be more of a continuum than we think, right? Like maybe it's not as discrete as you go directly from light sleep to deep sleep, but there might be something in between, which is like for a little bit not as clear. But yeah, that's the bit of the question, and I'm not like Matthew Walker would be better to discuss this with you.
That's cool. I guess another question around that would also be about a lot of these products say we're independently validated or we're validated by this research. Like, and I think a lot of people see that and like, oh, it must be good then. What are people not seeing in those kinds of statements sometimes?
I mean, it's always tricky because usually that means they did fund the research. And in principle, anything that is published should be peer-reviewed, which means that other scientists looked at it and said what they say is judged to be, we cannot judge it not to be true. We think the method was solid, and what they produced is fine or is good, but you don't really know what happened before then, or how, if there was any data excluded for whatever reason. Like people, even if things are not sponsored, researchers sometimes bias themselves or bias the data without consciously realizing it, but they're like, they have a certain hypothesis, they're testing it, and they see, for instance, ooh, this experiment doesn't work so well, but these 2 did. Yeah, and I think that day I was actually a bit sick, so I might have done, so I'm going to exclude that one. And you can come up in your mind with valid reasons to do it. And I can imagine if you're sponsored by Aura and they're pressuring you and they're like, yeah, we need the results and we think we're really good. I'm not saying this happens, but it could happen, right? Like if there's money on the line and they're paying for it, maybe they want certain results. I don't know. In principle, you would hope it would still be fully independent. But if there's that conflict of interest statement paid for by Aura, there is a slight, like there is something in my mind which makes me a little bit more skeptical, but I still hope they just did the job correctly. But they might have set up the experiment maybe in a way that's a bit more favorable to Aura, where they know they will perform well. So they took, I don't know if this is true, but I'm taking Aura as an example here, but it can be any company. So company X would think, oh, we know we actually perform best in white males, so we're only going to include white males in this study or whatever.
Yeah, interesting. I guess going off that a little bit in terms of like getting paid, I know one way as a creator that we get paid is like affiliate links, right? And we make commission based on, each click, and, Aura, Whoop, whatever, Apple Watch, maybe from Amazon, you get paid. So as a scientist, do you feel, I know you, like, what's your opinion on affiliate links and how do you use them in your videos, and how does that impact your kind of like N-of-1 research that you're publishing on YouTube?
That's a good question. So, I mean, I made some rules for myself, which are kind of random in a way, but I put any Amazon link there just because you make not so much on it. And even if a product is bad, I can just put the Amazon link there. There's no effort. Even if I say a product sucks, if you still want to buy it, that's fine. And I entered 3 affiliate programs over time, but only after the product improved enough that I would use it and recommend it. But that does give me, hypothetically, a financial incentive. So I think I'm still being unbiased, but who knows if subconsciously I'm not. So for me, the rule is I need to use the product myself, or one would use it if I had the space on my arm. So so I use Aura. I have an Aura, Whoop, and 8Sleep affiliate link, and they all did well in my testing. But I only entered their programs after a new generation did better. So for ate sleep, they at some point improved their sleep stage tracking from their normal. I think in the pod 2 it was still an older version. Then in the pod 3 at some point they upgraded to this, I don't know, it's called Hercules when you export the data. I don't know the official name. And that's when I joined their affiliate, but I already had the device for a year and a half. But I didn't like it enough at the time with that old algorithm and the way it was performing on me to recommend it enough to become an affiliate. With Aura, this is one of my first videos, and I really didn't like the Aura Ring 2 in terms of sleep stage tracking. So for the longest time, I made relatively negative videos, and I didn't want to be an affiliate. Then when they upgraded, I became part of it. But I still recommend people not to use my link, but to just get the discount link from a friend, because you don't get a discount with any link from Aura, as far at least they don't give me one. And Whoop, I joined at some point after the Whoop 3. This was one of the first ones I joined because it did well overall on me, and this was one that I would actually recommend to some of my friends. But it's a tricky business, right? Like, in principle, I would love to not have to do it, but I need to somehow finance all this stuff, and this is a way of doing it. But my rules, I would never be sponsored by any. They can never get to see any video before I publish it. I can never be sponsored by them in any way, and they will get a negative review if their product sucks. But yeah, I don't know how you feel about it.
I think your philosophy is very interesting. I believe in just putting the links there if even if I don't like the product, for some reason people still click it.
Yeah.
And I think I just try not to look at the numbers, because if I'm making extra, I guess it doesn't change how I talk about the product, but it does change if I make more or less content about the product.
Yeah.
So for example, I made some beginner guides about Aura and Whoop, and like that was the intention there, was like, all right, I just want to be, have more authority around these products. And it provides value, and it was also driven by the fact that I was like, okay, if I make these videos, maybe I can make more money.
Yeah.
But I wasn't trying to tie an opinion to it.
Yeah.
And I still try to stay true and honest to like what I would tell my friends in all the videos.
Yeah.
I do.
Exactly. Yeah, it's so hard. Like, I felt so, the first time I remember when I had the Whoop affiliate links and a few people bought it, I felt so weird about it that I just didn't make Whoop content for a half year or so, just because it seemed weird. I don't know, but maybe I'm just coming from a background of not earning any money from anything outside of my normal work. So I needed to get used to it. But I think it's a decent way. It's a fine way to do it, as long as it's not sponsored directly and you're not having to show them before.
Yeah. I think you're providing a lot of value to the viewers, right? And like, you need to be compensated somehow, but no one's paying you directly. Yeah. So it's like, and this is just another avenue to like cover the costs of all your camera equipment, buying products for testing and everything.
Yeah.
So
in a way, it's also good to be part of everything. Then so if every product would pay the same percentage commission, and you could just join everything. So that's my Amazon philosophy. Like, I have to put zero effort into this. The company's not directly involved, and I just put the link there. That would be the ideal world, where you still get a decent commission, but the company is somehow disconnected from it.
What if you just didn't know how much commission you got and someone else did it for you?
Yeah, that would be great. Like, if I just didn't
like hired an affiliate manager, and they would just put the links in the description for you. You didn't know how much money was coming from each brand.
If I didn't even know which brand had affiliate programs, this would be the best for me. Like, I just want to have enough money to finance all this stuff, and then I would be happy.
There should be a platform that just does all that.
Yeah.
Makes all the tracker links. That'd be cool. Okay, we talked a lot about sleep. I want to talk about heart rate.
Yeah.
Heart rate accuracy. That's another testing that you do.
Yeah.
Whether it's chest heart rate straps, wrists. Maybe the first question would be like, how do the different heart rate monitors work?
Yeah, so
at a high level.
At a high level. So I would say there's two main types. You have the chest straps, which use ECG, similar to the EEG for your head. It also listens to electrical signals, but not electrical signals of your heart. And these are really nicely well-defined signals. So you see this in TV series all the time, right? On the screen, this nice peak and dip, and you have these really clear-cut heart rate signals, and they're really nice and sharp. And they just listen to the electrical frequencies of your heart in really simple terms. And then you have all these other trackers that go on the finger, on the wrist, on the upper arm. Is that an English word?
Yeah.
And these all use PPGs. So polyplethysomnography, I always butcher that, but PPG. basically the shine light on your skin and then measure the reflected light. And depending on the phase of your heartbeat, basically that reflectance will be different. So then they can also get a signal of your heart rate. But this is more like a wave, like a sine type wave, which is not as nicely defined. So defining that peak is also a bit more noisy. So finding the exact peak of that heart rate. But of course, it's much more convenient. Like wearing a chest strap all day wouldn't be very comfortable, but wearing a watch all day or a ring is fine for most people.
Yeah.
So I think it's sort of a trade-off, just because generally a chest strap is just more reliable. There's some exceptions. DC Rainmaker would know even more about it, but in my experience, I found no scenario for me that it would not perform well. So this is also This is also my reference. I just know it works well. They've done some studies where they actually looked at the raw signals and they went through them and they checked how often was it noisy enough that the algorithm couldn't find the peak. So they just had an algorithm that normally measures your heart rate, pick each peak of the heart rate, and they would manually go through it and see, oh, here it was noisy, but there should have been one, it was like 99.9% accurate, like a crazy high number. And you will generally not get that with the more noisy signal here because it's a light signal that you're measuring. Also movement, there can be like light leakage coming in from the outside, and movement will affect it. So it's just not as clean.
So chest strap is electricity. It's very accurate.
Yeah.
Wrist is light, and it's a little more
varies.
complicated.
Yeah. There's good devices. You have one good device on your wrist. I mean, again, based on testing on me, but the Apple Watch is really great. Battery life of the Apple Watch maybe not so great, but performance of the heart rate monitor is very good. Also, when I tested it on Teresa, so my partner, or some friends, so far the Apple Watch just does best. And Garmin, I mean, maybe I'm the exception, but on me it's like mediocre in performance. It also depends. I tend to be, when I cycle, that's where it struggles most, and I tend to be quite tight with how firm I hold the handlebars, and this also makes it harder. There's a lot of movement.
Yeah, considering the wrist is a little more complex, what are the scenarios that work well and scenarios that don't work well?
So the more stable and the less tension on the wrist, the easier it is. So if you're doing indoor cycling, like I have my bike behind the camera here, this works fine. Most devices do rather well here, though again, really quick changes in heart rate, there they suffer. And with running, they actually, it's not so much movement or tension, but it's also the frequency of your running that can have an impact. So this is called cadence lock. You probably, maybe you know about it, maybe not, but basically if you run, that frequency of running comes close to most people's heart rate. So then that movement also creates a signal, and then it has two competing signals that it has to figure out which is heart rate and which is cadence. And often that cadence is even a stronger signal. And then it often locks onto your running frequency as your heart rate instead of your heart rate.
Interesting. I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Oh. Because I know my running cadence is maybe 160 to 170 steps per minute.
And what's your heart rate?
I guess I don't know if I hit a heart rate that high, but sometimes it'll be at 160.
Yeah. But it's both like normal range, and then it both gets like a periodic signal, and then it needs to figure out, okay, which is heart rate and which is cadence. And I don't know how they do it internally. I can imagine if you have just a gyroscope in there, you should be able to this is easy. I think computationally, like with an algorithm, you should be able to solve this. Yeah. But some companies are not able to do it so well. Garmin is actually rather good at solving that part. I don't get it's called cadence lock. So you lock onto your cadence instead of your heart rate. And for Garmin, I haven't experienced it as much, but for some devices it happens a lot more, for some a lot less.
What about like Apple and Coros?
Apple is doing quite well. Also, Coros is not actually that bad. Coros is also generally targeted toward these kinds of sports. So I think the Pace 3 did decent on me, but I haven't tested as many Coros devices yet. So hopefully the Vertex 2S soon. What was it? 3S?
Vertex 2X. 2S. Yeah. Coros, we gotta send you more. Gonna send you more watches, huh? Which one's the best heart rate tracker out of all these wrist devices?
So again, on the limited testing I've done on me and my partner and some other people, it's the Apple Watch.
Is there a certain Apple Watch model, software, size?
so far, generally more or less similar, but the weight of the Ultra might sometimes give it a bit of a downside. But then again, if you get a strap that makes it like I prefer these kind of Velcro ones. These I can generally get pretty nicely fitting. Then you don't have this stepped tightness basically, where it's either maybe a bit too tight or a little bit too loose. But generally, it doesn't make a huge difference. I wouldn't worry about it too much.
And what are certain things like I need to make sure it's tight? Is there, if it's too tight, will the numbers be off more? Like is how do I make sure my wrist heart rate strap is accurate enough?
This I also, so according to manufacturer specifications, often it needs to be quite tight, but also not extremely tight. But what is this? And I think in my testing, I haven't really been able to. I just tried to get a certain tightness the same on every watch as I read it in the manufacturer specifications. I haven't done specific testing to see, can I make it too tight? I also think it's very hard to make it very tight, just becomes so uncomfortable that nobody would wear it. The only thing many people have requested that I want to test sometime soon is to wear a couple of watches on the inside of the wrist where potentially there's a bit more fleshy area, so there might be a better signal. But I don't know, we would have to test it. So.
My mom only wears her watch on the inside.
Yeah. But she doesn't have a smartwatch, or does she?
She has an Apple Watch.
Really? Yeah.
But I know in the thing it says you're not supposed to do that.
Yeah, but I would want to test it. But I think they're how do you say it in English? The proof in the cake is in the eating, or the proof of the pudding is in the eating?
Something like that, yeah. Proof in the cake is in the pudding or something, I think.
In the eating? I don't
know.
The pudding is in the eating? I don't know.
I don't know. Don't quiz me on that.
But yeah, so in terms of range of watches, Apple is best. Garmin, depending on what you do, indoor cycling on me, fine. Outdoor cycling, mixed, and especially if they get heavier, I think they struggle. Garmin watches like your Epix 2 Pro get pretty big and heavy. Huawei is doing well on me, but I mean, it's a Chinese company with not so much access to the American market, so maybe your viewership will have trouble finding them. And I mean, it also depends a bit. I don't know how much you want your data to be sent to certain regions, but I guess Coros is also an Asian-based company, so I also don't know how that goes. I have no strong opinion. I'm fine with my data going different places, but I totally get if people don't want to have it go outside of the EU or US-based companies.
Yeah, interesting. Well, heart rate. Okay, I've heard a lot of people say like, I feel like this watch is more accurate, or I feel like that watch is more accurate, but they're not basing it on anything. No. Like, what do you have to say to those people?
Yeah, just buy a chest strap and test it out. It's so easy, like for €70, or watch some videos. But if you really think something is off with your watch, if you buy a chest strap and wear it well, and then you generally get a pretty reliable measurement, unless, I don't know, maybe super dry areas that are super cold or so, maybe the conductance is not very good, but I think almost in most use cases it will be fine. And otherwise, just watch some of my videos to get a rough impression. But again, I think their skin tone is something I should account for at some point, but I cannot. I think a lot of these watches are made for basically white or light-skinned people. And there have been frequencies of light that just struggle more on very dark skins. So that's why also watch manufacturers now include different kinds of light. Sometimes it's even a bit more yellow, I think. But I think Polar has mentioned that they really try to also adjust to different skin tones, and this must be true for more manufacturers.
Yeah.
But again, most testing is done on like not the darkest skin, at least on YouTube and stuff. I guess you have maybe a medium, I don't know how you would describe your skin tone, but not extremely dark at least, but maybe definitely darker than me already. But I would be interested if somebody with a dark skin tone, maybe from African ancestry, could test it. That would be very interesting to see how the brands do that.
Yeah, that'd be really interesting.
I mean, electronics are, how do you say, historically not created for people with dark skin tones. Also, cameras and stuff were in the 70s and 80s notoriously bad, I think.
Almost everything. Right?
Yeah, it's just...
Everything was made for the white male.
Yeah.
Now we've taken into account women as well, and then also other skin tones.
Yeah, which is good, but yeah, I think still the developers tend to be males also, and the testers tend to be males. I think it's a very male-dominated industry.
Yeah. Well, we need to get more women testers now. Okay. So with the Apple Watch, do I even need to buy a heart rate strap then? Is it pretty good?
It's pretty good. Only for weightlifting, it will. I noticed that it's pretty good at detecting when it's failing, but then it will just not give a heart rate, so you will miss the peaks. Because
do I care too much to have heart rate in a weightlifting workout?
I think it's just a lot of these things are just interesting to me. The question is, what do you do with them? That's really, if you're really a high performance athlete, there might be scenarios, or you want to run at a certain heart rate, or I just think it's cool. Like a lot of this stuff I just find cool, and I just want to track, and then I want to track trends over time, like what was my max heart rate over time, because I've noticed that it at some point really went down, my max heart rate during my workouts, and it was just because I wasn't pushing myself as much. So it was also teaching me to start pushing myself a bit more to actually reach that heart rate, because you're just getting a bit lazy and taking too many breaks, and then you just don't reach that.
So yeah, so is like having an accurate wearable gonna change my life in any way, or is it more targeted for the audience that thinks it's cool or interesting, and then the elite athletes who need specific data for specific type of workouts?
That's a tricky question. I think in terms of sleep tracking, I think there a lot of the advice given by Whoop, Aura, whatever, that has decent quality data and decent algorithms behind it can change your life for the better, where they will recognize something was off that night. They will maybe even suggest, hey, did you do one of these 3 things before bed? Thereby informing you, hey, this could be you ate a late meal, you, I don't know, had a high stress moment before bed, and then try to avoid those and actually improve your sleep, and then hopefully improve at least your health span or lifespan a little bit. So I think they can definitely help. Or if you're trying to get healthier, you track your resting heart rate over time, and this is also good for normal non-athletes. So no, I think there's something there, but I think we also shouldn't over rely on these kind of metrics. And also we still feel, right, we still have some sense of self and how our body feels that day. So yeah, if you don't find it cool at all, then you need to have a specific goal in mind, which can be better sleep, or maybe running with a certain performance, or running a certain distance, so you need a good GPS tracker or whatever.
Yeah. Speaking of GPS, what are the GPS accuracy learnings that you've had, and how do you go about testing that? Because that's
a tricky one.
A little tricky, right? With the weather, location, all those things.
Yeah. So what I do, and this is just by convenience as well, is I have a certain route I cycle to work, and I cycle that 5 times a week basically, and I just track that same one every time with the same wearable. And if it's good, then those tracks should be super consistent. They should follow the same, because I just cycle the exact same route. So that's a bit of a indirect way of measuring it. That is to say, if the thing is good, it should be super consistent. Like they should overlap super well. If it's bad, they could still overlap perfectly, but then it can always be off like a lot, for instance. But then there's some systematic reason it would always be off by the same amount. I think it's relatively unlikely that that particular thing happens. So it's a bit of an indirect way, because I have no reference, but what I can do is make sure that each time I do the exact same thing, does it measure the exact same thing? And that's basically my best guess. You could then try to incorporate areas with higher buildings where it's harder, and then see, does it deviate a lot more when the buildings get higher, so the signal quality is worse. But yeah, indeed, there could be weather effects that I cannot take into account. So it's just when I have the device, I test it for those 2 weeks or so, and then the whatever 10 rides or 8 rides that I have. So that's what I can include. So there's definitely limitations. I saw that Ray from DC Rainmaker was doing it more also on a running track and stuff, but then the question is, how representative is that of urban running or urban cycling? Or this is the best I can do now. And yeah, you do see big differences. Like the big differences you see super clearly. The subtle differences are sometimes a bit more tricky, but again, that's where Garmin is one of the best at GPS, and this is also what they invested in. Some other watches just suck at it. There's really bad ones, like for instance the Fitbit Charge 6 is a quite relatively affordable device, It's definitely decent at sleep. It's decent at heart rate, but then the GPS is just like not worth it. Then you use your phone instead. Like it can even connect to your phone and use that one instead. But the internal GPS is just, I don't know. I wanted to say a bad word, but it's not good.
What are the best ones? Are there specific Garmin watches, or pretty much all the Garmin's are good?
Pretty much all are pretty decent. But I always set them to the best settings. So you can choose different GPS combinations basically, or GPS is like using it as an overarching term, even though not all satellite systems are GPS. But I haven't seen huge differences between Garmin models. They're generally all pretty good. I guess there would be edge cases where some of the newer ones with the better signals do better. But even initially, when they introduced some new better models, it still felt like the software needed to be sort of catch up with the hardware that was improved. But that usually happens quite quickly.
Yeah. And GPS is there's like 4 or 5 systems, right? Do you know the details?
There's GLONASS, there's Galilei. So there's all these. There's the European agency has some. America has GPS, and then they're all. So GPS originally was, I think, developed for the American military, and at some point they made it available to the public to use as well. And basically, I'm also not the expert in this, but what it boils down to is the more triangulation points you have, so the more satellites you connect to, the better the better you can actually triangulate your location and also your elevation.
But these watches could connect to any of these satellite systems, essentially. Yeah. Someone once said that Apple owns their own satellites, and maybe they own some satellites, but I don't think they own their own positioning satellites.
I would imagine not, but maybe I'm totally out of the loop here.
I don't know.
I'm also, I'm more focused on the testing and the technical details. I also don't have all of them. So
yeah. And then one of the scores that people always get is like the readiness and recovery scores. Have you ever tested the accuracy of these? Is there any insightful information that you can take away from them? What's your opinion on them overall?
I mean, it's really tricky to say what to do with them. There was this paper out, and I don't remember all the details, but they looked at the readiness score again. I think there were 2 papers from that lab. I don't know if you recently saw Aura had like a statement like we were shown to be the most reliable sleep stage tracker by this and this paper. And I think, so I was in contact with the author of the lab, and I think from what I could understand, they did do an independent job, but they were at least sponsored somewhat by Aura. I don't know if it was just that they got the devices or whatever. And they also looked at the readiness score, and there they could correlate it with certain subjective metrics of people. I honestly don't remember what it was, but you can imagine it might be something like how they felt during the day or so. So there is something to be said of it. Also on my own data, there is a correlation between my readiness score and how energetic I felt that day or metrics like this. But then maybe my total time asleep is also strongly correlated with this. So the question is my total time asleep a lot better or worse than my readiness score? I'm still a bit skeptical that the readiness score is that sophisticated that it really gives me that much more detail. It tries to, but I don't know how validated this is. And again, without being able to back it up with any data, my experience is just that it's a good indicator, but that there's also other good indicators, and that it might be the best we can do at the moment, but more research could definitely improve it.
Like they could just be saying, all right, total sleep time is 50% of the score.
I mean, that's what it basically is. It is something like that. So it was a long time ago, I don't know if they still use the same algorithm, but basically I could just deduce from the metrics what it was made up from. It was just a linear combination of some of these things, like weighted, like 50% this plus 20% this per 20. And then it's just an estimation. I don't know how they developed it. I don't know what the basis, maybe there is valid theory behind it, but I don't know it. But it is a linear combination. Yeah. It used to be, at least.
Yeah. I want to take a step back now. I know you make all these videos and this is not your full-time job. Like, why do you make all these videos? Like, what's the reasoning for going through all the testing and trying to find the best and most accurate product? Like, why are you doing this?
Yeah. So why I'm still doing it is because I think it's cool, but I think it originally started because I felt this content wasn't out there in the way I would want to see it. I would want people to test it in a systematic way and actually tell me, I want this and this, what is best for that, and then actually compare it against all the others in some kind of reasonably reliable metric. And it just wasn't there. And there were definitely people doing good testing, but there were some things missing there, like sleep, but also direct comparison against other watches, like many other watches at the same time with a reproducible system. And I just thought it was missing. There was it was COVID time when I started doing this kind of thing. So I had a lot of time on my hands. I was just recently single, so a lot of things in my favor.
Yeah. And what's like doing all this testing, what's like a future goal that you have? Of like what's a big vision, something exciting that you want to do in the future with all this type of testing? In
ideal world, in whatever, 5 or 10 years, I would have a big sort of testing center where different people would get the same watch that just came out. They would have a testing protocol. They would have to follow this. I would use all these different people's data. Plus people all over the world could share their data with me, where they have a chest strap or some kind of reliable sleep monitor and their wearables. And there would be a really good resource out there that just tells you these devices are good at this, these are good at this, and you could just research for what you think is important. And even you could see, okay, for women, this actually works a bit better than this. And for people with a dark skin tone, maybe this works a bit better than this. So ideally, I would be have the biggest reliable data collection for health.
That'd be really cool. Apple has like a research app. Have you seen that at all?
No.
I think some like institutions can use it to run research, and they'll pull data from like Apple Health. But it's specific to that. That's I guess like one way of doing advanced studies.
So at the moment there's a startup called Terra, and it's called a universal API. What it boils down to is they have a system where people can connect their wearable to, and then you can either build an app or some website where you can then pull that data. So they gave me free access for at least a limited number of users, and I'm now building a website where or I hired some guys to build a website where people would be able to connect their wearables and share their data with me. So at least that initial thing is starting, and this also includes Apple, but also other wearables. Though some companies don't have the best data sharing options out there. Whoop is notoriously bad at these kind of things. So I cannot even get to my own raw data, so I also cannot get to other people's raw data. I think this is also quite bad. You should always have access to your own data.
Yeah, that's right. Good. Europe has a good system, I guess, for that, or at least rules that make it a little bit easier.
Yeah, but then, so we have GDPR, it's called here. Basically means you have the right to own your own data and to tell companies to delete your data. But it has some stipulations in there, which I think Whoop officially is still abiding by the rules in terms of data sharing, but they're just really taking the least, sort of the most lenient form for them in terms of sharing it. Like, I think it says derived data, they do not need to share. So if they derive your sleep stages from your heart rate and movement and whatever, they don't need to give you your sleep stage data because this is derived from other things.
Wow, interesting.
At least that was my interpretation, because I thought I can just ask them, like I can tell them GDPR, you need to, but then I read the fine print, and I'm not a lawyer, but this is how I understand the GDPR regulations.
Wow, I didn't know that. I'll have to learn more about that. That's cool. In terms of if you were to recommend someone a health tracker or wearable, what should people buy? Or what would be the best one out there?
It really depends on your goals or what you want to know or what you find interesting, cool. And also what kind of requirements you have for battery life and stuff. So I think if you just want a cheap-ish watch or device with reasonable sleep tracking, reasonable heart rate tracking, then something like a Fitbit Charge 6 is not too expensive. Probably you can get it for like $120, $30 if it's on sale. And you get decent heart rate, decent sleep stage tracking, decent heart rate tracking, and the device looks okay. I think then you're set for not too much money. You ignore the Fitbit Premium subscription, you still get most of the data. So I think that's the cheapest option I would recommend to, like, I don't know, if my mom wanted to track some of her heart rate and her sleep, that's what I would tell her. Like, it's cheap, it's easy, there's not too much complexity going on there. Then if you wanted more to be in a smartwatch form, you could even get a Pixel watch if you were on Android. But it has, I think the look is, for a man, for instance, not the nicest. That's my personal opinion. It's just a bit small, I don't know. But I imagine some people do like it, and the battery life just gets worse. The Charge 6 has a much better battery life than the Pixel watch, but they basically use the same system. So Fitbit, it was bought by Google, so the Google Pixel watch basically uses Fitbit on the back end, I think, to do most things, like sleep stage tracking. So for Apple users, I think the Apple Watch is one of the best things, just because it integrates so well with your phone and with what other device you have. Plus, it has really good heart rate tracking, really good sleep stage tracking. But the health app itself, I don't like too. I don't think the data presentation of Apple is very informative. And I tested this out by also giving a friend of mine an Apple Watch, or letting him use it for some weeks. And he's a Whoop guy. Like, he's been using Whoop for a year or two, and he really loves it because he really looks at the app and what it recommends him. And he says he likes that the Apple Watch has a screen that can do all these things, but there's just no recommendations coming out. There's no context to the data. There's no explanation to what you see. So he just missed that. So even though he liked the Apple Watch as a product to use with his phone, he just misses all that. And that's where I think if you're more into general health, you want to get decent sleep stage tracking, decent heart rate tracking, and you want sort of general health advice or some feedback, their Whoop is really good. They're sort of not amazing at anything, but they're just solid throughout. That's my impression of Whoop. They're not the best heart rate tracker, they're not the best sleep stage tracker, but they're good. They're decent or good, and they have a nice app with feedback. But it's then again not super cheap, or at least to me, a subscription model is always like it makes it sound cheaper at first, but if you calculate it over 4 years, it's not a cheap device per se. Also not like crazy expensive, but yeah, you pay, what is it, if you do it like yearly, maybe, what is it, 15, 20 a month? I don't know the exact rate at the moment, but
depends, on which plan you buy. 15, 18, I think.
Yeah.
$30 if you do it monthly.
Yeah. So it's not crazy expensive, but it adds up over time. So, but then you do get the new device when that comes out. So I guess there's the benefit there, and they easily replace it if it breaks. At least mine broke, and they just sent me a new one.
Yeah, that's good.
And then Aura is the same, I would say, but it has a bit better sleep stage tracking, but pretty poor heart rate tracking during exercise. So if you're really into exercise, then the Aura ring just isn't enough. I think the heart rate tracking just doesn't work. I think, I don't know what it is, because when they released it, they were like, on the finger we have a much cleaner signal, and I just don't think it works. I don't know what it is, but it just doesn't.
Yeah.
I don't know what did you try a lot of heart rate tracking with the Aura ring?
A little bit. Mine's also a little bit. It depends on what size you get. There's no half sizes, and I don't like to have rings on my finger, so I got the one that's like slightly too big instead of the one that's too small. And then I think it spins pretty easily. Yeah. So it's not that.
Yeah, mine is pretty well fitted, but it just I think Aura has like the best app, like the best feedback. They're slightly better than Whoop in that regard for me. Like the whole overview is just, I don't know. I think it's a bit more, it's a bit easier to look at. But it's not a huge difference. But if I were to choose between the two apps, it would be Aura in terms of app. Also, sleep stage tracking is a bit better. But then I just cannot use it for sports. So I would need a second device for sports, which would, as a consumer, annoy me a little bit, maybe, to a degree at least. If I would have to buy two things now. But yeah, and also GPS, of course, you don't get it with either. And then if you're just looking for long battery life with decent heart rate tracking, good GPS tracking, then I would get rather a Garmin, I think. Just because there's a nice ecosystem to connect a lot of sensors to. So if you're really into sports, that's quite nice. The sleep stage tracking just doesn't tell me much. So if that's important to you, then Garmin probably isn't the way to go. Polar somehow seems to need to improve a little bit before I can recommend it. The devices they make sometimes look really good, but then the reliability or like the accuracy just isn't there, at least on me, and also on some others now. Again, this is my experience. I wouldn't be my first choice at the moment. But then again, if you connect the chest strap with your Polar, then it doesn't matter again, then that's fine. And if you want a cheaper Garmin, then Coros is still, like I like the Pace 3, for instance, it was pretty reliable. Then just depends a bit if you want that ecosystem or not. But I think Coros is fine too. It's like a slightly more budget-friendly Garmin, and it works well, and it also has decent quality heart rate.
Yeah, cool. All right, now rapid fire questions from Instagram people. Follow me at Shervin Shares if you don't already. All right, if you have only $300, Coros or Garmin?
I think 300. That's a tough margin. I might get the Pace 3 then, and though I would be tempted now that the Forerunner 265 is out to get that one. Tough call. I like both. Yeah.
One of those two. Yeah. Okay. How do you sleep with all the intense sleep tracking gear on your head?
Yeah, I don't have any issues. Even with when I sleep with polysomnography, which has like a big unit here and then all the wires, somehow didn't bother me too much. I'm also a back sleeper, so it doesn't interfere with me too much. I hate it when something is here in my neck. Otherwise, no issues.
Yeah. Where are you from? Are you German?
I'm Dutch.
Dutch. Is Apple Watch the best?
It's great at heart rate and sleep. Battery life sucks, and their app is not the best.
Yeah.
So best at some things.
Cool. And where can people find you?
You can find me on the Quantified Scientist on YouTube.
Nice. And do you talk or on Instagram, Twitter at all?
I have an Instagram. I should use it more. I plan to at some point use it more. So if you want to preempt that, you can go. I think it's also Quantified_Scientist. I don't have TikTok. I have Twitter. I'm Quantified Rob. I think not Bob. There's a Quantified Bob, which was one of the first NS1 quantified selfers. I'm Quantified Rob. What else did you ask?
I think that's it.
Yeah.
I guess go check out his YouTube channel. You have a ton of amazing videos. Like, it's crazy to see you just like sped up and grew way past me. And like,
not in views.
Subscribers for sure in terms of growth. Like the amount of value that you provide in the testing is just something out of this world. And we're gonna make some videos together. So if you want to see those, make sure to subscribe to both of our channels. Turn on notifications for both. Hopefully we'll have some testing videos, some really cool stuff on both of our channels. So stay tuned for that. Other than that, I hope you enjoyed this episode. Subscribe to this podcast, wherever platform you're on. If you're on YouTube, hang out, leave some comments, and we'll see you in the next one. Thanks for coming on, Rob.
Thanks for having me.